All right, well, as people join, I will give an introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the virtual talk celebrating the Group of Seven Centenary. My name is Grace Johnstone. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, and it's my pleasure to welcome you virtually this afternoon. We are streaming to you live virtually from Toronto, Ontario, and I'll begin with the land acknowledgement. I begin by acknowledging that the land on which this presentation is taking place here in Toronto is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Anishinaabe, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet in this community. We'll get started in a couple of minutes and I'll turn it over to Ian Dejardin, but first a few housekeeping items. We are streaming live today over the internet to over 3,000 people from around the world, and we all know how unpredictable our connections can be, so please be patient. If you're having trouble with your internet connection, try leaving the meeting and joining back in through the link in your confirmation email, and we'll do our best to accommodate everyone. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, there is a chat button at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. You may need to move your cursor around to see it. Type your question into the chat and it will be sent to the meeting hosts. After Ian's presentation, we'll take about 10 minutes or so to answer your questions, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. If you would like more information about any of the images that are shown during today's presentation, including full captions, you can find most of them on the McMichael's e-museum, which is accessible at collections.mcmichael.com. We're also very excited to announce that we will be partnering with Google Arts and Culture to bring more of our collection online to you digitally through the Google Arts and Culture platform. So stay tuned for that launch in the next coming months. Additionally, today is also the debut of Canada's Post new series of Group of Seven stamps, and our archives at the McMichael worked closely with Canada Post to provide archival photos of each member of the group for their official first day covers, which are available online through the post office as of today. Finally, today's talk is being recorded, and you'll be able to find a copy of it after the talk on our website, on our YouTube channel, on our social media channels, and we'll also send around a link in a follow-up email after today's talk. So if you have to pop in and out, you'll be able to see the full thing after today. With that, I'll turn it over to Ian Dejardin, Executive Director of the McMichael Canadian Art Collection and Curator of the exhibition A Like Vision, the Group of Seven at 100. Ian, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Isn't this very odd? We're all sitting at home. In January, I was very lucky. I was given the task of hanging a major show at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, which we called A Like Vision. And this was pure self-indulgence for me. It meant that I got down into the vaults of the McMichael and chose works. We were thinking of maybe 100 works. In the end, it's more like 280 plus. So we got that up in late January, and we were planning all sorts of great events. And then you know what happened. Of course, today is super important because for us, this is the centenary of the first exhibition that the Group of Seven put on. It opened on May the 7th, 1920, and ran for 3 weeks. Of course, we had planned all sorts of events. There were going to be wonderful parties and wonderful private views and wonderful tours and all the rest of it, all of which look like conspiracies to commit whatever the opposite of social distancing is now. So we couldn't do that, but we couldn't let this go past without marking it in some way. So I hope you'll enjoy what we've put together. What I've done is basically try to remember a favorite tour through the exhibition. It's been a really nice exercise, actually, pulling together some of my favorite images and really just to celebrate the Group of Seven and what they achieved. We're looking at the wonderful Lauren Harris's Mount Lefroy at the moment, and I'll just move on from that because we'll be revisiting that later. Okay, stop moving first. Let me get this moving. There we go. This is actually a rather odd slide. I'm sure you'll agree. This is just an image of the catalogue of the exhibition, just to remind us that it was a very lo-fi business altogether. This was a little folding catalogue. It listed 121 paintings in all, 114 of them by the group of 7. There were 3 invitees as well. But it did feature an essay by Lauren Harris, who was there were no leaders for the group of 7, but he was the leader they didn't have, if you like. And he was by far the most dynamic person, I think, in the group. He was leading the way. And his essay reads quite, I find it slightly hilarious today. It's extremely polemic. It's extremely defensive. He makes references to so-called art lovers, and says that they prefer to enrich the salesman and accept the productions by artists native to the land. I should just add that, of course, 3 of the group of 7 were from England. MacDonald was from Durham, and Varley and Lismore were from Sheffield. But however, native to the land, he says. And then he ends by saying the artists invite adverse criticism. Indifference is the greatest evil they have to contend with. So what's going on here? Well, in fact, indifference was a mercy, really. The 10 years before the foundation of the group of 7, these artists have been trying to make their way in what was a really reactionary society. And they attracted some really quite abusive criticism. Famously, the mild-mannered MacDonald was described as having created something that looked like the contents of a drunkard's stomach. And they were christened the Mush School. It was quite a challenging atmosphere for artists to work in. So Harris's essay is understandable. He had something to react against. The gauntlet had been thrown down. They knew that they were not going to be received well. They were more than likely going to achieve an awful lot of very vituperative criticism. But in there, there are some wonderful paintings. And the quotation came from that initial paragraph in which Lauren Harris claims that the group of 7 artists here today shared a like vision. And that's why we used that as the title for the exhibition, because they certainly did share a like vision at that time. And it's interesting how that came to be. They were a natural group in many ways and had built up relationships over the last 10 years. MacDonald and Harris had met early in 1911, then, when MacDonald had put on an exhibition at the Arts and Letters Club. And they were kindred spirits. Harris had recognized the kindred spirit in MacDonald and admired his work. And they started putting together the fabric of what was to be the group of 7, even then, even to the extent of doing so architecturally, because Harris, who very fortunately for him, was an extremely wealthy man, the heir to the Massey Harris farm machinery firm, had built a studio building, the first in Canada, the first such building in Canada, which was to be, if you like, the hotbed for this new revolutionary group of artists. All was on track, actually, for an opening, I think, of a group of some kind in 1914. The artists all knew each other. 5 of the future group of 7 all worked together as commercial artists at Grip Limited and then at Rouse and Mann. They were already going on sketching trips into Algonquin Park with Tom Thompson, who was a linchpin of this group at this early stage. And so they all knew each other, they were ready for action. And then, of course, the First World War broke out. And 6 years were lost. And it was not until 1920 that, in March 1920, that the group founded themselves. And then on the 7th of May, had that first exhibition. What we're looking at now is a painting that might well have been in that show. One of the frustrating things about that catalogue that I showed you earlier is that it refers very often just to 4 or 5 sketches without naming them. This is a wonderful image by Lauren Harris from Montreal River. And it's dated about the right time. It's certainly around 1920, but it could be later. It could be after the exhibition. We don't know. But it's a very good indication of the quality of the work that went into that first show. It's based in Algoma. Harris, MacDonald, Johnston, and Jackson had been going to Algoma since 1918 and were really working through, I think, the influence of Tom Thomson, because of course, along with the great tragedy, the overwhelming global tragedy of the First World War, a more local and personal tragedy had happened in the meantime, in that Tom Thomson had drowned on Canoe Lake on July the 8th, 1917, and so was no longer there to be part of the founding of the group. He would certainly have been a member had that tragedy not happened. This is a good place to start as well in other ways, because this was the very first painting that Robert and Signe McMichael bought when they started collecting. And so this is the beginning of the McMichael Canadian Art Collection's story as well. They did well, I think. But if you look at what we're looking at here, it's what I would call a piece of modernist painting. It's a beautiful landscape. It's very attractive. It is featuring bright colors, very visible brush strokes. It's actually quite small. This painting would be about 21 centimeters by 28 centimeters. It's a sketch, if you like, done en plein air, sitting outside. And it has no aerial perspective. It uses thick paint. It uses brush strokes in a very descriptive way, so that you have slabs of horizontal brushwork for the water and dabs of bright color in the background to suggest autumnal trees, I think, is the idea here. And the sky is the same color as the water. So none of all of those careful tricks of aerial perspective that realist painters of previous generations have gone for. What is this coming from? Well, it's ultimately coming from post-impressionism. And I don't think it's relevant really to describe it as being influenced by post-impressionism. I always think of post-impressionism as a kind of force, a force of nature, if you like. That decade from 1910 to 1920 was a period of considerable dialogue and discussion amongst artists. And that really sprang from great exhibitions that were held in England in 1911, 1912, and in America in 1913 on post-impressionism, the great post-impressionism shows. This is what introduced Cézanne and Van Gogh, and even Marcel Duchamp and Matisse to an astonished public. And for artists, nothing would ever be the same again. And I really do think that rather than being influenced by those artists, what post-impressionism represented was a liberation, a liberating effect. It showed artists that they could use color dramatically, that they could use paint in visible gestural ways. It was hugely liberating. And I think that's what you're looking at here. I would also say that we've come to think of these works by the Group of Seven as purely Canadian, as somehow national. They have to do with Canadianism, if you like. I think that's a red herring. I'm sorry, I do. Basically, there are artists across the world painting like this at this moment because they too are liberated by post-impressionism. I think of, say, Pekka Halonen or Akseli Gallen-Kallela in Finland, or Nikolai Astrup or indeed Munch, the early Munch in Norway. They were painting in a similar way. There's nothing particularly Canadian about it. Sorry, but that's my opinion. So let's just move back one. There we go. I wanted to introduce the artists themselves with imageries, but it's one of the great tragedies of the Group of Seven that they didn't have someone like Grace, my colleague Grace Johnston, advising them there on marketing and communications. They were all commercial artists, but one longs for them to have got in a decent photographer to take a few brand images of what the Group of Seven looked like. the studio portraits that exist of them are now so familiar that they've become rather dull. And frankly, they're a bit boring. And so I looked somewhere else, and I found it in the vaults of the McMichael, in the drawings of Arthur Lismer, of course, one of the group of seven, who, it turns out, never went anywhere without a sketch pad and drew in various different styles. He's a wonderful draftsman in a full exhibition style, does beautiful drawings. He does cartoons as well. And I think these two really qualify as that, but also very fine kind of quick sketches, snapshot sketches. And of course, because he was working with all of his friends in the group, he drew them all. And I can think of few better images to introduce Lauren Harris, the force of nature that was Lauren Harris, than these two really very funny images. The one on the left somehow absolutely captures that electrifying presence. Harris was hugely charismatic, hugely energetic. There's a very funny series of cartoons by Lismer where Lismer records a trip, painting trip up to Lake Superior with Harris. And these images show Harris bounding like a gazelle up mountains with Lismer trudging behind, carrying his heavy equipment. He was full of energy, and this drawing just shows that perfectly. You somehow know that Lauren Harris could never see a table without putting his feet on it. It also captures one of his characteristics, which was his hair. Rarely, I think, has hair ever suggested character more forcefully than Lauren Harris's, which has all of the energy that he exuded himself. He really gives Albert Einstein a run for his money, I reckon. And it was because of that that I chose the other image on the right there, which was Lauren Harris having his hair cut. I always imagined that anyone who had to cut Lauren Harris's hair had to have the nerves of steel. And this image surely confirms that, this poor benighted gentleman tackling that extraordinary thatch of white hair, looking slightly traumatized as you would. So there he is, Lauren Harris. Let's get back to the art. This is an important painting as well. It dates from around 1917. And it's called Snow Fantasy, and it reminds us of a very important part of Lauren Harris's journey towards the group of seven. All of the artists were trying out different kinds of art on the way to the establishment of the group of seven as an entity with a kind of cohesive like vision, as they put it. And this is one of the stops along the way for Harris. In early 1913, he and MacDonald had made the trip to Buffalo to see an exhibition of contemporary Scandinavian painting. And they were thrilled by what they saw, because what they came across was a group of artists like those Finnish and Norwegian artists I mentioned earlier, who were translating their particular northern landscape through the medium of post-impressionism into something that was very nationally recognizable, that was different from, say, the mid-European style of art that had, for instance, prevailed in Norwegian art before that generation. And one artist that they certainly saw and admired, and that particularly influenced Lauren Harris, was the Swede, Gustav Fjeistedt, who made something of a thing of painting snow-laden trees exactly like this, but in a far more romantic, realist style. They're beautiful, beautiful paintings. Harris has taken it a bit further and brought in a few post-impressionist tropes. These horizontal brush strokes, dabs of color, the pink, the violet, the blue, with the occasional touch of bright scarlet just to set things off. This is part of a discussion, I think, that was going on amongst the artists. You have to remember that they were all meeting up regularly, the Arts and Letters Club, discussing the latest trends in art. All of the artists, apart from Tom Thompson and MacDonald, had in fact studied at some point in Europe, or in Johnston's case in the States. They were highly articulate, highly educated They knew what was going on. They knew what was in the air. They could read Studio Magazine and see what was the latest artist and what they were doing. So you have to imagine them having many discussions about how to paint. And evidence of that can sometimes be seen in the paintings themselves. And I think if you look at the way he's painted that painting around 1916, 17, and then look at this gorgeous thing by Tom Thomson from 1916. This, sadly, for those of us with hindsight, is Canoe Lake. This is the site where Thomson was to drown barely a year later. And you can see that he is painting in the same style. This is not characteristic particularly of Thomson, who tried out various different things. He was, after all, really only embarking on his career. Thomson starts as a proper professional artist, thinking of himself as anything but a Sunday painter, only in about 1914. He has 3 years as a career. It's astonishing what he achieved, but it's a very short career. And during that time, he is experimenting all the time. And I think this experiment comes out of the same conversation, probably, that Harris came out of with his Snow Fantasy. Who was leading this? Probably Jackson. A.Y. Jackson, by far, I think, the most highly trained of the artists at this point, who had spent many years in France. He was in France from 1907 to 1912, who came back with a full technique and was very prone to discuss issues. It was a hotbed of dialogue about what art was and what it could be and what they wanted it to be, how these European styles could be applied to Canadian landscapes. Back to Harris. This is actually, it's called In the Ward, and it was painted in 1922, so it was actually after the group of 7 were formed, but he was painting urban scenes right back in 1911, 1912. It was something that he enjoyed doing. It comes from, I think, his period where he studied in Germany and came across social realism there. And he did us all a great favor because, for instance, the Ward, this particular old part of Old Toronto, was demolished eventually and is now the site of Toronto's rather space-age 1960s town hall. The Ward was a ramshackle old place, but it was full of character. This view reminds me of nothing so much as Walter Sickert's views of Dieppe. And I put it in because it reminds us very nicely. This is a small painting again, a sketch. It reminds us of one thing that is consistent about Lauren Harris from the very beginning, and that was he is an exquisite colorist. The colors of this little painting are absolutely glorious. That green, that emerald green, the more livid green, the blues, the dark blues, and those little patches of yellow and orange pull this whole thing together. It's one of my favorite little paintings by him. Later, of course, Harris, like the other artists, was dealing with the death of Tom Thomson. Thomson had been in Algonquin Park and had made it his own. And in those 3 years of his short career, he produced some 550 dazzling small sketches, which took Canadian art in an entirely new direction. The sense of immediacy that he found there, the sense that you didn't need to look for the big picturesque subject matter. You could just sit down by the side of the path and paint what you saw in this extraordinary, bright, new, liberated style, bright colors. And in Algoma, where Harris went with his 3 colleagues between 1918 and 1921, I think those artists were really working through that legacy. They had had to focus through the death of Tom Thomson on that legacy. They had looked carefully at this astonishing group of paintings that Thomson had left behind. And in those 3 years, they really worked their way through those images. And quite quickly, and this is the point I want to make here, Harris moved on. he stopped being interested in the detail. In this painting, you can see him working his way. He is not interested in leaves. He's interested in trees. It's the big picture. He doesn't want detail. He wants shapes and he wants form. And this painting from 1922 shows him moving on towards where he goes next. Jackson very neatly in his autobiography, A Painter's Country, describes how Harris very quickly found Algoma too detailed, too much information. He wanted a more pared down, a more abstract version of landscape. In this, he goes off in his own direction very, very quickly. And this is an early example of where he was going. He's using color in slabs of color. He's simplifying the imagery. He's interested in the shape of the trees, not the detail of the trees. And where it leads, of course, is where we started, to Mount Lefroy, because he found on the north shore of Lake Superior and here in the Rockies, he found the kind of sublime landscape that he was looking for. And this was all tied up with his spiritual approach to art. He was a theosophist, and please don't ask me what theosophy was. I've never understood it. It's very hippy-dippy. It's very New Age, in fact. It seems to have an awful lot of New Agery to it. But it did involve a kind of coming together of Eastern religions, and then an overall sense of finding the divine in the world, in the landscape. It's as if in Mount Lefroy, Harris is taking an actual scene, a famously steep and beautiful mountain in the Rockies, and turning it into a craft work, something carved as if by a divine hand. He simplifies, he makes it more abstract. I've put in onto this screen also one of the 3 sketches that the McMichael owns that lead up to this final painting. Mount Lefroy itself is a very grand, very large painting. It's one of the grandest paintings in our collection. But if you look at the sketch on the right, this is perhaps the earliest of the 3 sketches we own. I could really have tricked you all by reproducing that sketch, that full size at the large scale, and reproduce the large painting at a small scale. And actually, I think you'd have been quite hard put on to differentiate between the two. The point I'm making, and this is a recurring theme in this talk, is how artists, the group of 7 particularly, tended to work from the sketches. I've often said how I think the Great Canadian Oil Sketch is one of Canada's greatest gifts to humanity. These small iPad-sized sketches just brim with life. They're astonishing, they're beautiful, they are unique, and there, if anything, is the great innovation that the group of 7 brought to painting in general. And the relation between the initial sketches and the final finished canvases is a very interesting one because it differs with each artist, frankly. In Harris's case, you find very often, as in this case, that the initial sketch does not look that different from the final painting. In other words, the imagery, that idea of the formal imagery, the abstract, the simplified view of the mountain, the simplification of the form of the mountain, it's there right from the start. It emerges fully formed from Harris's brain. And really the process of the sketch to the painting is a fine tuning. It's not a translation. It's merely fine tuning what is already there. And of course, Harris is clearly on a path towards abstraction. And in the 1930s, that's what he did. He moved to America and then moved back eventually to Vancouver. And as an abstract artist, again, with very spiritual leanings, it moved him towards pure form. And here, as a kind of surprise, I think, to many people, is the very late Lauren Harris, around 1967, in fact. And as you can see, he's still a magnificent colorist, but my goodness, his palette has very much changed. There are some very disrespectful members of my colleagues at the McMichael who refer to this painting as the Mystic Pizza. We'll pass over that. But nonetheless, it's just called abstraction. But hang on, we've seen it before. There it is again. I swear, this painting is Lauren Harris looking again in abstract mode at Mount Lefroy. Elements of the composition, the exact nature of the triangle of the mountain, even the circle of cloud at the top of the mountain and the kind of aureole of light around that are reproduced here. I think the painting meant such a lot to Harris that he's revisited it in abstract form. Now let's move on. The next room in the show is dedicated to J.E.H. MacDonald. And I've chosen this lovely drawing. Again, this is by Arthur Lismer, and it captures this gentle person. He was much the oldest of the group. He was in fact 47 in 1920 when the group was formed, and older by some years. The next oldest would have been, incidentally, Tom Thomson, who would have been 43 actually in 1920 had he not died in 1917. He was actually older than a lot of the group, considerably older than Lauren Harris and indeed Jackson. MacDonald here is shown pensive. He was a quiet character, and so it's rather a shame that he was the person who bore the brunt of all that abusive criticism as he was finding his way in the 1910s. He left Grip Limited in 1911. It was a very brave move. He wanted to go freelance. He had 4 elderly relatives to look after and a young son and wife. He needed to find a way of earning a living, struggled all his life. He found it in teaching and he took on commercial work. But in 1911, he was really looking at ways of becoming a painter. I've chosen another image of him, which is actually not by Lismer. Let me go back. It's by Frank Johnston, of all people. And Frank Johnston is not known, at least wasn't known to me as a sort of cartoonist, as it were. And you can see it's a very interesting drawing style. But this is a portrait of MacDonald. And MacDonald, of course, discovered the Rockies like Harris had before him around 1924 and goes there every summer. And this drawing, Johnston has called it, he has given it a particular name. It's called Acting Principal MacDonald. And then he has a quote, which I can do particularly well, I might add, given my background. The quote is, "His heart is in the Highlands." I don't know why he waxed Scottish. MacDonald was not a Scot. Durham, I hate to tell you, is not in the Highlands of Scotland. It's in the north of England. That's where he came from. The Highlands here are, of course, the Rockies. I think it's a wonderful drawing. I love the little detail in the background of someone hauling a mule up one side of the mountain and then chasing the mule down the other side. Incidentally, you can see it's signed. It's signed Franz Johnston. Frank Johnston changed his name to the more exotic sounding Franz Johnston in 1927, so that gives us some idea of the date of this image, I think. Now, this is a lovely painting. It's one of my favorites. It's early, it's 1917 by MacDonald, and it illustrates the point I was just making about how he was trying out various different ideas. He was a very flexible artist. He could try all sorts of things. He even tries his hand at illustrations of Indian war parties and things like that. I think he's thinking of Frederick Remington. Anything really to find a market, I suspect. This painting I love, and I suspect I love it for very personal reasons. I suspect it's because it's very English. It's a very English painting. It's a very arts and crafts kind of painting, I think. And by that I mean that kind of high horizon line and the lovely silhouetted haywain at the back. It reminds me of an awful lot of nostalgic painting from the 10s and 20s that I particularly love in England from my background. And I'm going to arbitrarily show you an example of just that. This painting is by an English artist called Horace Wooler. It dates from 1929, and it's a watercolor. And it has that, it's rather faded now, but it has that wonderful sense of a pastoral landscape between the wars that's long gone. It's kind of Forsyth's Saga meets Paul Nash, but in a beautiful realist way. It has a particular resonance for me. I actually own this painting, and it's by my great uncle Horace Wooler, who I never met, but was a really rather fine artist, and interestingly was an interestingly spiritual artist too, like Lauren Harris. Very interested, and he was very much involved with she wasn't actually a theosophist, she'd moved on from theosophy, a woman who was running a kind of spiritualist group, and great uncle Horace was involved in that in the 1920s. I just put it in there for sheer self-gratification, and I hope you enjoy it. I think in many ways it's due to great uncle Horace and this painting in particular that I actually took up art history, so you can blame him. Now back to MacDonald. I mentioned Algoma before. This is a classic Algoma painting, and actually this is a famous painting. It's called Leaves in the Brook, and it became famous partly because it became a sort of poster child for the Group of Seven. One of the group's great achievements, there were two I could point to, other than just their own works as great painters. One was that they encouraged other artists, so that for every Group of Seven show, there was always invited artists who showed with them. And by the end, the 8th show, there were 28 invitees there. So they were encouraging a whole new generation of artists. That's one thing. But the other thing was that they put themselves together as a group really to put on exhibitions. That was the idea. They were an exhibition broking group. And they were spectacularly successful at that, because not only did they put on the 8 Group of 7 shows at the Art Gallery of Toronto, as it was then Gallery of Ontario now, they also were involved with either organizing or contributing to, very lavishly, touring exhibitions, particularly in the States. Dozens of exhibitions toured the States during their 12 years. And of course, famously to England as well, in 1924 and 1925, the Great British Empire exhibitions, where they made a real splash and actually garnered their very first rave reviews in England, which they leveraged later back home. And this painting, this wonderful thing, Leaves in the Brook, was actually, for instance, in 4 of the touring exhibitions in the US. So it was clearly highly valued and seen as particularly characteristic. This is a painting where MacDonald, who had been a great mentor to Tom Thomson, is, I think, really paying tribute to his mentee, Tom Thomson. This is Algoma. It's MacDonald really working through Tom Thomson's legacy. And I'll just show let's go back there, the sketch that goes with it. Now, looking at these 2 paintings together, the comparison with Harris and the way that Harris developed, fine-tuned an already perfect sketch into a much bigger, grander painting. Here, actually, the 2 paintings are very similar again, but in this case, MacDonald has gone to extreme lengths to really replicate the things that make that sketch so electrifying. the brightness of the color, the quickness of the brushstroke. He's imitated it in the final painting, even to the extent of disguising, if you like, the care that has gone into the composition. He's changed the composition a little to make it more readable. But apart from that, it looks very much like the original sketch. In other words, the lesson learned, I think, from Tom Thomson, and to a certain extent Jackson was also a very fine sketch maker too. But the lesson learned particularly from Thomson is immediacy. It's the fact that those quick sketches tossed off in perhaps half an hour en plein air had the vibrancy and life that was what this group of artists were really searching for. MacDonald tries to replicate that, to capture that life, that vibrancy, does it particularly well in this painting. And here's an example of what I mean. This is Tom Thomson himself, Autumn Woods, it's called, not surprisingly, from 1915. And you can see exactly what I was talking about. This is a very quickly painted work. It's utterly ravishing. The color control is extraordinary and instinctive. In 1912, Tom Thomson was painting in shades of gray. Goodness knows what happened in the meantime, but I think it was basically through chatting with A.Y. Jackson, with whom he shared a studio in early 1914. Basically, those chats with other group members electrified Thomson. And he became one of the greatest colorists that Canada's ever seen. And one of the great things about his use of color is how completely he uses color to suggest tonal gradation. When you look at a small sketch by Thomson, you can feel the air, you can feel the temperature, you can feel the wind going through the trees. They are truly remarkable. Here he is. One of the, I just thought I'd put in an image of Tom Thomson. This is one of my favorite images. It's not often seen, this photograph. It illustrates another irritating fact about Tom Thomson, which is he was easily as interested in fishing as he was in painting. And sometimes you just wish you could have spent a little bit more time painting, but I suppose we shouldn't grumble. Here he is with his output of the day, not 4 little sketches, but 4 fishes, which he's caught. He's sitting on the steps, probably of Mowat Lodge, where he was staying, and the proprietor of Mowat Lodge is on his right, on our left, Shannon Fraser, not Harpo Marx, although that's exactly what he looks like. I won't go into the various conspiracy theories about how Tom Thomson died. Shannon Fraser features largely in one of those conspiracy theories. Let's move on swiftly. The point I want to make here is that Tom Thomson is the only member of this group who comes out of the rare photography of the time well. He was exceptionally photogenic. He always looks like he's being played by the young Gary Cooper, which is why I like these images, because again, Arthur Lismer has provided glimpses of Tom Thomson actually at work. And somehow he captures in these quick scribbles something more important about Thomson. Just look at that one on the left. He's scribbling away, looks to be with a quill. He was an expert in drawing generally, but also in lettering. It's possibly what he's doing. But the detail is, of course, the spilled ink. He's knocked the ink over. He's completely oblivious. His long legs are stuck out underneath the desk. Somehow he captures something essential about Thomson. And on the right is an image probably from later that year. By 1912, 1913, Thomson was going to Algonquin Park every summer and spending the summer there, painting as much as he possibly could, camping in the wild. He became so adept at that in fact he became a guide to other visitors to the park. And this is an image of him. You imagine him sitting possibly by the campfire, flexible, smoking his pipe. He was a quiet and introverted individual in some ways, but good company by all accounts. And he would travel into Algonquin Park very often in company. There are photographs of him with Lismer, with Varley, and Harris was there too. He was a good person to spend time with. Back to MacDonald. And my point here, I think, is that this image, which is another of these wonderful 28 centimeter by 21 centimeter sketches, is, I think, the equal of the great Tom Thomson in sketching. MacDonald gets there quite regularly. He was a very fine painter, of course, in his own right. And under the influence, I think, of Thomson, he reaches really unparalleled heights. And this, I think, it's called Beaver Dam and Birches from 1919, thereabouts, is perhaps his greatest sketch. It's certainly the greatest, I think, at the McMichael, and one of the greatest paintings, I think, in Canada. It's not always the big ones that are the really hugely important ones. The lesson from Tom Thomson here is that seminal one, that Canada can be found wherever you're looking. In this case, MacDonald has seen a beaver dam. That's what the brown thing in the foreground is. And the beaver has, in building the dam, raised the water level. The water level at that height grazes the very bottom of this grove of birch trees, so that the reflection in the water is without any kind of interruption from the verge of land between the two. It makes for this extraordinary explosion. It's like a firework display. And this painting, I often say this, it looks as if it's got a light behind it. It's really remarkable. One last painting from MacDonald, this from 1932. The death of MacDonald in 1932 was, I think, one of the things that hastened the end of the group of seven. With their father figure gone, it was felt that they needn't carry on much longer, and indeed they wound up very soon after his death in November 1932. This painting dates from 1932 and was presumably done in the summer in the Rockies. And it illustrates a point about MacDonald, which I find interesting, which is that he adapts his style to the geography. You can observe this throughout his work. He uses different styles for different types of imagery. And in the Rockies, he develops this wonderful palette, these grays, these purples, these pale greens. And he uses flat color, flat planes of color. It's something to do with, I think, with the thinner air of the Rockies that he's trying to record. He records it in technique, and I think that's a testament to his expertise as a painter. This is a lovely thing. So sad that he was to die soon after this painting. Onwards, A.Y. Jackson, a gorgeous Lismer sketch of A.Y. Jackson, capturing all of that bull in a china shop element of Jackson's character, the energy exuding from this extraordinary profile. Jackson, sadly, was one of these people who seems to have looked about 106 even when he was a teenager. There aren't any photos of Jackson where he didn't look rumpled and ancient. And this is such a good evocation of that character. He was a feisty man. He was one, along with Lismer and Harris, he was one of the fighters, one of the people who talked up the aims of the group of seven loudly to anyone who would listen. And Lismer also provides us with one of his cartoons, which I'll go back to. There we go. And you can see it was addressed, "Please return to A.Y. Jackson Studio Building." He had always had a studio in the studio building right through until, I think, until the 1950s, in fact. And this wonderful image, I think probably the lanky character on the right of this image is Lismer himself. He always depicts himself with his pipe, and he had a particular Monsieur Hulot type posture, which is always recognizable. Anyway, the joke is, of course, that Monsieur Jackson, à son travail, as described, Monsieur Jackson is only visible in the top of his beret. He's surrounded by interested bystanders, all peering over his shoulder as he works. And I do suspect that A.Y. Jackson probably did attract a crowd wherever he went. He famously is called Père Raquette in his native Quebec, because in the depths of winter, Jackson would stride out into the snowy landscape on his snowshoes, raquette. And I'm quite sure he attracted a crowd wherever he went. One of the discoveries of this exhibition was his drawings. We have hundreds of Jackson's drawings in boxes in the vault, and they were a revelation to me. They are, as it happens, things of beauty in their own right, but they are also very different from, say, the exquisite drawings of Franklin Carmichael, which we'll see one of later, or indeed Lismer. They are working drawings, first and foremost. Here, he's recording a historic trip, really. In 1928, for the first time, Jackson must have covered every inch of Canada. He was indefatigable. He covered all areas of Canada. Nothing stopped him. He hiked up Mountain Dandale, canoed across everything. And he made it to the Arctic. And he did it by blagging his way onto the Beothic. That's the little boat that you see in the background, the steamer. This was the supply ship for the Canadian Mounted Police up in the Arctic. And he persuaded his way onto it by promising the official concerned, who managed the Beothic and its supply, that he would provide him with a painting of the northernmost point of Canada to hang in his office. And that got him on board, and off he went. And again, he went in 1930, and this time he managed to get Harris on board as well, and Lauren Harris went too. And it's that trip that this drawing is recording. And you can see how quickly it's drawn. The fact of the matter is that Jackson used his drawing, his sketch pad, like we would use an iPhone today. Anything that caught his eye, he did a quick sketch. And he was such hand-eye coordination, of course, he could capture anything really quickly. And there are dozens, hundreds of drawings capturing everyday life in Canada at the time. They're a tremendous legacy that he leaves. Here we have him, and you can see that he is also making notes. He's not thinking of a beautiful frameable drawing. He's making quick notes. He's got little notes on color. He records all sorts of details that he wants to bring forward, that he remembers as being important from the vision, so that he could, if necessary, work it up at a later date into a painting. Now we're back, looking backwards into 1913. The point about Jackson, I think, is that he was highly trained. He had worked his way on actually, basically, not quite stowing away, on a steamship to France at a very early age, and returned there once or twice. And he was there from 1907, for instance, to 1912. Painting in the countryside, learning. He went to the Académie Julian. He studied with various people. And we have to realize that by 1913, when this painting was done, it's called Early Spring, Emileville, Quebec. He was a thoroughgoing, professional, experienced artist, and he's painting in what you would perhaps call a romantic, impressionist, realist style. It's a very international style at this moment. There are many artists working in this particular style, but it's a wonderful, wonderful painting. You'll notice there's certain elements of it. The very high horizon line is very typical of this kind of painting. And also, he's interested in the blue shadow of the tree in the foreground. This is, again, something that you see, for instance, in the work of the gloriously named Marc Aurèle Suzor-Coté, Quebec impressionist, slightly previous generation, who was also working in that kind of style, a really, truly great painter, Suzor-Coté. But that blue shadow, it reminds us again, I think, of the fact that there is very much conversation going on. In 1913, Jackson was basically headhunted by Harris and MacDonald. He was on the point of absconding from Canada altogether. He was fed up with the Montreal scene where he was based. He found it dull, he found it reactionary. He was on the point of moving to the States, in fact, when a letter came from MacDonald. And Harris, far be it from me to suggest he bribed him, but basically Harris bought a painting, furthermore, Edge of the Maplewood, from Jackson that he had admired. And between the two of them, they invited him to Toronto, and he very quickly was super impressed by Harris's dynamism and the level of chat that was going on between these artists. And so he eventually stayed. And again, he was persuaded to stay by Dr. McCallum, who was an early supporter of the group, the Algonquin School, as it was then referred to, or the Hot Mush School, if you were being rude. Because Dr. McCallum agreed a remarkable thing, which was to subsidize both Tom Thomson, who at that point saw himself as basically a Sunday painter, and Jackson, in order to persuade Jackson not to leave the country. He subsidized them for a year in 1914, and they moved into the studio building, sharing a studio. So Jackson and Thomson were briefly very close. They became very good friends. And I mean, just look at this. Here we have Thomson, the year after Emileville by Jackson, painting what is, to me, again, a very arts and crafts looking painting. It's got that high horizon line. And look at this, look at that blue foreground, the shadow of the tree. He's been talking to Jackson. And here's the sketch, just to prove the point. This is actually a very inferior slide, and I apologize for it, of this sketch, because I've often said, although I love the painting, it's called In Algonquin Park. Although I love the painting, it's a masterpiece by Thomson. Actually, the sketch is better. The sketch is sensational, and it breathes light and air and wind. And if you look at it, the difference between the two, here we are again discussing a sketch being made into a finished canvas. The sketch, there's a lower horizon line, more sky is available. And that's where all the air and the wind comes from in the sketch. In the sketch, Thomson isn't so interested. He's interested in the broad point of the blue shadow in the foreground, which is far more violet. But he's not interested in the particular silhouette. He's interested that it's there, but he doesn't go into any detail. It's very quickly done. When he works it up into a painting, Thomson, it very often feels, and this is true of all of Thomson's finished paintings, I think, that he is creating an image that will go into an exhibition. In other words, he's quite self-consciously creating an exhibitable finished canvas. And so he takes the sketch as an inspiration and then develops it into what he thinks will be more acceptable to, say, the National Gallery, who might buy it. And in doing so, he's turned it into an arts and crafts painting. And in this, he's very much been influenced by Jackson, I think, quite possibly the exact painting I just showed you. But otherwise, that's the point I want to make. When Thomson develops a sketch into a painting, he's translating it into almost a different language. And in this case, he's translating, I think, to push the symbolism a bit too far probably, he's translating into French. This is a French painting. Now back to Jackson. And I just put this in because it's gorgeous. It's a really early 1912 sketch in pure Impressionist style by Jackson. And the slightly sad thing about it is that it's the River Somme. The River Somme in 1912. And of course, Jackson, when war was declared in late 1914, went back to Montreal and eventually enlisted. He was the first, I think, of the group to go over and fought as a private in the trenches before becoming a war artist for the Canadian War Records, set up by Lord Beaverbrook. And so he would have encountered what the Somme was later to look like. And when we look at the great masterpiece that dominates our collection by Jackson, which is this, First Snow Algoma, I think there is a memory of the trenches in this painting. It's perhaps not too much. He got back from the war in 1919. He had been actually wounded earlier when he was fighting as a private before becoming a war artist. And he had, in this very year, in 1919, Jackson exhibited along with Varley and, interestingly, David Milne in a huge exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, where I worked actually in the 1980s when I first saw the Group of Seven in a book. But anyway, in 1919, there was a major exhibition of the war artists' work. And Jackson really dominated that show. There were 36 works by Jackson in it, a huge number. Varley only had 6, for instance, in that show. David Milne, something like 19, I think, works. And so he was very much thinking about war artists, was very much aware of war art. And of course, other Canadian War Records war artists included, for instance, Paul Nash, Augustus John, artists like that. He was very aware of what war art looked like. Now, the interesting thing, again, talking about a sketch being made into a final painting, we don't have the sketch, so I can't show it to you, but Jackson told his niece, Naomi Jackson Groves, that the original sketch for this painting was devoid of the foreground. In other words, it didn't have the dead trees, nor did it have the snow, the wisps of snow blowing across the landscape. These were things that he added to make the final painting more dramatic. And it seems to me that those dead trees must be a memory of the drama of the Flanders fields. And I put in an example, let me go back, which is a photograph of Somme. This is the Battle of the Somme. And in fact, the Battle of the Somme raged in 1917, I think, from July the 1st to November of that year. And the thing about it was that it reduced a beautiful landscape, the landscape that Jackson painted so beautifully in the previous slide, to this absolute nightmare of shattered trees and churned earth. Surely that's a memory of this in this painting. By 1926, Jackson had become really the most dramatic of the artists. He was very radical at this point. This painting is positively psychedelic, I always think. It's called Lake Superior Country, 1924, in fact. And as Harris was paring back detail, Jackson was going for it. He was really going for the colors here, these extraordinary purples and pinks and oranges and greens. This is as radical, I think, as the Group of Seven ever got. But later on, he found a more lucrative, I think, form of painting. These are 4 little sketches. His paintings of Quebec are very important. He always went there in the winter and painted. He was interested in recording the vernacular architecture of the farms and churches of rural Quebec during the winter months. And he recorded them very beautifully. And in doing that, quite deliberately, it was a kind of almost an environmentalist approach to the landscape. In doing that, he actually struck a bit of a gold mine. A lot of these paintings were very saleable, as he discovered. And so there are many, many of these beautiful paintings of snow scenes in Quebec. They are beautiful things. Now we move on to Lismer. And Lismer himself, and I've put in a photograph here because it's actually quite significant. This is Lismer in 1911. This was the year he arrived in Canada from Sheffield. And he's sitting in the office at Grip Limited. He got a job there immediately. And significantly, he's reading Punch magazine, which was famous for its cartoons, its humorous content. And actually, you can see, if you look closely, it's the coronation edition, the coronation of George V and Queen Mary, which happened in June of 1911. So that dates it rather nicely. And on the right is a record of a very significant visit to the studios of the Group of Seven in 1927. The tall figure with the pipe, we recognize him immediately, is Lismer himself. The tiny childlike figure next to him, I'm sorry to say, is Emily Carr. Misogyny? Well, quite possibly. Emily Carr clearly made an impact on the Group of Seven. She was a formidable character, but she was obviously also quite tiny. And so here she is, and I'd long to know what that painting in the background is. I suggest it's maybe, quite possibly, a couple of trees by Emily Carr. We don't know. But anyway, there he is in his waistcoat and his pipe. And early on, 1920, Lismer is a very fine landscapist. Georgian Bay brought out the best of many of these artists, and I think this is a gorgeous thing. This is rain in the North Country from around 1920, so it could have been one of those paintings in that first exhibition, who knows. I don't know why it's called rain when it's quite clearly sleet or snow, but he really has caught the wind. It was the weather of Georgian Bay that really inspired these artists, that west wind howling across Georgian Bay, the islands of Georgian Bay, the weather system moving in. This is what they found so inspiring, and Lismer really hits it here. It's a wonderful, wonderful small sketch. He's better known for major pieces, set pieces like this, Bright Land from 1938. This is a classic. If there is such a thing as a classic Group of Seven painting, surely this is it. It's formal, it's slightly mannerist, I suppose is the word for it. It's full of vibrancy. Lismer is a very graphic artist. He uses strong lines and strong motifs. You get these snaky twigs and branches in his work. He draws in black around his forms. He's a very strong graphic artist. And of course, he was a teacher as well, so we know that he would certainly have been looking at Picasso, for instance. And gradually he starts looking downwards at the base of the pines and producing these wonderful, extraordinarily vivid and quick sketches of a really difficult subject matter, the roots of pine trees. And eventually, in the 1940s, he gets to something like this, which I fully admit I never admired until I hung it in this exhibition. And it's called Canadian Jungle, and I now absolutely love it. It's taken me many years to fall in love with Arthur Lismer, but I finally got there. This slide doesn't do it justice. It's encrusted with paint in jewel-like colors. And he somehow managed to carve form out of a really very difficult subject, the roots of pine wrack on an island. And finally, for Lismer, this lovely painting, playing with the idea of frames, the window frame that he's looking through, the frame of the painting itself, a view through to Montreal, where his studio was. This is called From My Window, Montreal, and it was painted sometime in the 1940s. But the important window here is in the print at the side. You're basically looking through a mount, which is another kind of window after all, into a reproduction of a very important painting for Lismer, Van Gogh's Sunflowers. And Van Gogh's Sunflowers provide all of the sun in this particular image. That yellow is picked up throughout the painting, and the painting shines. Van Gogh was important to Lismer. Moving on to Varley. This is a lovely little sketch of Varley. He was not bonny, I'll tell you that right now. He had a face like an old boot, a particularly Yorkshire character. He talked like David Hockney to the end of his days. One thing I can say for him, and my colleagues accused me of being obsessed with this fact, but he had great hair all his life. He was also very attractive, apparently. He was very much a womanizer. And a wonderful, wonderful portraitist. This is our girl in red. And it's pretty clear who he's thinking of here. One of his great heroes, someone that he exhibited alongside in that war art exhibition in 1919 in London, England. That is Augustus John. Augustus John, who was the sort of leading portraitist and a huge sort of superstar of British art at that date. Forceful, wonderful portraits. This is Varley at his best. Even in that very first exhibition of the Group of Seven, he exhibited portraits, and portraiture was really where his heart lay. But he was certainly an amazing landscape artist too. And I've put this one in, one of my favorite portraits by Varley, because it captures so much character in sketch form. This is not a finished portrait. This is a model in the studio that he has captured the character of brilliantly in very quick brush strokes. This is a virtuoso portraitist at work. But here we have him in the Lynn Valley. And the Lynn Valley is significant. This is called Moonlight at Lynn from 1934 because Varley was invited to be a teacher in Vancouver at the College of Art there in 1926 and went there and had his studio in the Lynn Valley. And I'm sure, again, that he is looking at European models here, and the model is surely Ferdinand Hodler, the Swiss artist. But he always includes himself. I think the figure in the bottom left corner is Varley himself. And to kind of develop that still further, here is, I think, his masterpiece in that regard. This is Night Ferry, Vancouver. Now, in 1935, he basically abandoned his wife and children and went back to Ottawa. And this painting was done from memory. It's a memory of the ferry that he would take at night from Vancouver across to the Lynn Valley. And it has a kind of psychedelic, slightly disturbing air to it. And there he is again, standing, striding up, the legs apart at the bottom, viewing the moon across this turbulent water. It's a wonderful image, a very, very beautiful painting, very unlike the rest of the Group of Seven. He always had his own color sense. Moving on to Frank Johnston, I'm particularly glad that Lismer provided us with images of Frank Johnston, because otherwise there's only one photo of him and he looks like a very disgruntled bank manager in it. These images show Johnston as a young man with a flop of hair, wearing a bow in one, holding a picture of Carmichael, a sketch of Carmichael in his hand in the one on the right. So Lismer has provided us with a relief from the bank manager, but actually, you know, even Lismer had to show him as a bank manager eventually. His painting it's an anomaly because Johnston left the Group of Seven almost immediately. He exhibited 17 works in that first exhibition, largely Algoma pieces like this one, but he did not stay. He was invited to become principal of the Winnipeg School of Art in 1921 and left, and effectively left the group of 7 at the same time. He could have carried on exhibiting with them, but he didn't. It was the only time he exhibited with them, and formally resigned in 1924. But in Algoma, Johnston also is working through, I think, the legacy of Tom Thomson, who had been a colleague of his at Grip. And this is the nearest that Johnston gets to looking like a group of 7 painting. But interestingly, even in Algoma, he is working in a different color sphere, and he uses different techniques as well. This is in fact a gouache, and he uses gouache quite a lot on paper. But he also painted in tempera, which is an odd thing for him to have done. Here's a watercolor in gouache, and I included this in because actually Dennis Reed, the great Dennis Reed, scholar of Canadian art, included this as he tried to replicate the 1920 exhibition on the 50th anniversary of their founding in 1970. And he identifies this as being one of the paintings that was in that show. So I thought I'd better include it. But again, it's a beautiful painting, but it doesn't particularly look like what any of the other group were doing at that time. In 1921, he's already moving away. This is Lake of the Woods in 1921, a little sketch. And it again feels slightly different from the others. And he's moving towards a more realist kind of art. And one of the discoveries for me about Frank Johnston was that in the 1930s and 40s, he produces a series of paintings like this. This is called Dark Waters. It's oil on board. And it's a very European genre, this idea of water and snow, reflections in water, in a kind of realist mode. And in the exhibition, which I hope you'll get to see eventually, there's an entire wall of these paintings. To a certain extent, they became, for Johnston, the equivalent of Jackson's Montreal, Quebecois paintings. They are, well, if you were being cruel, you would say pot boilers. But actually, I think they're rather exquisite, very sensitive. On to Carmichael, who I'm unashamedly fond of. He's my favorite, I think, of the group. And again, he managed to be not in the only group photo taken of the group of 7 at the Arts and Letters Club. Carmichael was elsewhere on that occasion, and they never thought to regroup for a photographer. But here is an absolutely glorious little sketch by Lismer of Carmichael. I always think of Carmichael working away quietly in a corner somewhere. He was a great virtuoso. He could paint in oils. He's famous as a watercolorist, but I think almost too famous as a watercolorist. It overshadows his other achievements. A wonderful printmaker as well. He's a great man, and he died too soon in 1945. Here's the great masterpiece at McMichael. And here's its sketch. And again, we can analyze what's been going on here, because again, Carmichael is slightly different in his working up of sketches into finished paintings. What he does is edit. He takes his sketch, which is very obviously by Carmichael, those striations of color. He works in a particular style, which is all his own, which he tidies up. In transferring to the finished painting, he tidies his striations, he makes them neater. But he also does something with the tree on the right. In the sketch, it slightly overbalances towards the left, and he's given it a prop at the bottom, a tree stump, which is not in the original sketch. He's given it a tree stump to kind of prop it up and made it more upright so that it doesn't feel like it's overbalancing. And he's changed the color of the water so that it registers more clearly at the bottom left. So where Thomson is translating and MacDonald is trying to replicate the immediacy of the sketch form, I think I would characterize Carmichael's approach as editing. He's editing. And this is what he's famous for, these grand panoramic landscapes in oils, with this very particular, almost striped approach to the landscape to take it back in time. If you're not going to do advanced aerial perspective, you need to find other ways of suggesting receding landscape. But he was also particularly adept at suggesting the light on distant water. And he does it very beautifully here. It's a gorgeous painting. It's called Bay of Islands from Mount Burke, and it dates from 1931. And here's a perfectly glorious sketch. The thing about that, he's often criticized for being too decorative. I don't think you can ever be too decorative. I'm not scared of decorative. And I think his color sense just shines in these little sketches. They are particularly beautiful. This one from probably around 1920. So the kind of thing that showed in that first exhibition. One thing that gets forgotten about him is that he is a remarkable commercial artist, a wonderful printmaker. This gorgeous thing of irises on the left, penciled irises it's called, from 1934, is a colored lino cut, in fact. And on the right is a wood engraving for an illustrator from a book. He was a wonderful book illustrator too. These two things are just gorgeous. I mean, have you ever seen anything as gorgeous as those irises? I don't think so. They're particularly wonderful. And a surprise with which we end the show. This is called A Northern Silver Mine and dates from 1930. And I think it shows, I think I may be wrong here, but I think it's the town of Cobalt, which was a major silver mining town. And many artists had found their way there, including McMichael, and many of the women artists in the 1920s also painted at Cobalt. Jackson found his way there eventually as well. And I think what attracted them was that in a country which didn't have kind of Tuscan hill towns to paint in any kind of picturesque way, the ramshackle buildings of the mine shafts and those wooden buildings that were, by this date in 1930, were beginning to tumble down. Cobalt's heyday was over by this point, provided an equivalent, a picturesque equivalent. This is a triumphantly gorgeous painting, and there's a wonderful watercolor as well of it. Now, moving on towards the end of my talk, I just had to mention the three artists who joined the group of seven later. Johnston having left formally in 1924, A.J. Casson took over his role as the group of seven. And of course, as a member, he was a member much longer than Johnston was, and a very important member. And this painting, White Pine, 1957, the oil painting of this, is one of the most famous images at the gallery. It's probably, in fact, arguably the most popular image at the gallery. It's a tribute, I think, to the Jack Pine by Tom Thompson, which by that point was iconic. But it's interesting that it's a variation on, it exists in several forms, dating back a full 10 or 15 years earlier. Its first version was a watercolor. It then appeared as a tempera. It appeared as a print, as a serigraph. And I think it was McMichael himself, Robert McMichael, who persuaded him to do an oil version for the McMichaels. And this is the result, and a very important painting it is too. He's often seen as kind of almost as a, I think the cruelest thing you would say would be it's kind of paint by numbers group of seven artists. He is much more than that. And Casson has a cool quality all his own, austere, grey, silvery, ravishing. He was also an exceptional draftsman and a wonderful commercial artist. It's no accident that this is such a powerful image. This is the image you want on calendars. He just knew how to create an image that would have maximum impact. But he was also the poet, if you like, of rural Ontario. This is Bancroft, and Casson went throughout rural Ontario, recording the small villages and small towns. He was doing for the vernacular architecture of Ontario very much what Jackson did for the vernacular architecture of Quebec. And he carried that torch right into the 1960s. This is Cassen, the little island, from 1965. One of my favorite paintings in the collection. Sheer beauty, the silvery quality of the sky and the reflections in the water, with these jade and cinnamon shards almost of tree, and in the background trees like feathers, painted like feathers. It's very distinctive, very precise, very graphic, and very, very beautiful. I won't hear a word against him. Finally, Edwin Holgate, joined in 1929, a very well-established Montreal artist who did beautiful landscapes too, but he is particularly another portraitist like Varley, very fine. This is actually not a portrait. He described it as the head, but in fact it's his wife Frances, recognizably his wife Frances. But what he's painting here is not so much a portrait as a character head. The story is Frances had been in the garden and wrapped a towel around her head, and he was struck by the image and turned it into a painting. And here is the last member of the group of seven, represented by one painting only, Lionel Lemoyne Fitzgerald, the little plant. One of my favorite paintings in the collection, surely a masterpiece. He's an oddity. We did a wonderful show about him last year, a major show on Lionel Lemoyne Fitzgerald. He was an odd fit with the group of seven. He was invited to join in May 1932, and the next letter he got was early in January 1933 from Lauren Harris explaining that the group had been disbanded. So he was a member of the group of seven for all of 8 months. However, he earned space, and he is a great, great painter. And this is my last slide. You may have thought I would never stop, but here it is. Lismer has the final word. And the point about this image, he calls it a study in dynamic symmetry. The gravestone says, here lies the group of seven. The date of this painting, of this little drawing, is 1933. Now you could just think it's, oh, right, the group of seven have disbanded, they're dead and gone. But actually there's more to it than that. Look at the tree. The tree is full of little birds, and he's labeled them handily, fledglings. The ground is full of little flowers sprouting up from the mound that carries the group of seven. This is because immediately after the group of seven was disbanded, the Canadian group of painters was formed, early 1933. All of the surviving group were members. There were 28 members in all. And their first exhibition in 1933 had 52 painters in it, including, for instance, Emily Carr. 9 women involved. There were no women, of course, in the group of seven. This was rectified to a certain extent by the Canadian group of painters. The interesting thing is that this image seems to suggest that for the group of seven, the end of the group of seven was not a matter of mourning. It was the birth of the Canadian group of painters. They had done their job. They had become the art establishment. They had changed the language of Canadian painting forever. And more importantly, and it's to their credit, they had given birth and support to an entire generation of Canadian artists who could take it from there. It's one of the ironies of history that the group of seven, all the fairy dust that was going, they are the ones who dominated the 20th century in Canada. The Canadian group of painters, wonderful group of painters, but they didn't have the same fairy dust, and many of them have been forgotten. The group of seven cast a long shadow, and that shadow carries on to this day. Artists still quote the group of seven, still paint like the group of seven, or, almost more importantly, utterly reject the group of seven. Both standpoints are creative and vital. I hope you'll join me in raising a glass to the group of seven tonight. They deserve it. They did well. I finish there. Over to you, Grace.
Well, thank you, Ian. That was absolutely riveting. And I think I speak for all of us when I say thank you so much for sharing those incredible images and your knowledge with all of us. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in. We're going live to over 3,000 people around the world. We appreciate all of your questions and comments in the chat, and we will try and get to as many questions as we can in the next few minutes. I know you're all anxious to hear from Bruce Cockburn as well, and we'll be turning to that shortly. Questions that folks have had now, just to say as well, this talk is being recorded, so if you missed any portion of it, we will send around a follow-up email afterwards with a link to the presentation. You can also find all of the images and captions on our website that we'll make available, and there will be a link to the presentation as well on our website. So thank you again. Some questions. Let's start with the technical one. How would the group travel with oil sketches back from the wilderness to their studios? And can you say anything about the how they preserve their materials working in such difficult conditions?
This is a really, really good question, in fact, because it's one of the most important things about the Group of Seven, that they painted these oil sketches. I've mentioned the size they are. They're about the size of an iPad. And actually, they painted those for a very good reason, which is that if you are out in the wilderness, so-called, and trekking and canoeing and portaging and all the rest of it, which they did, you cannot go with a full canvas. You cannot cart enormous boards round with you. And so they painted sketches because it was practical to carry them around. And the wonderful thing, and the answer to this question, is that, for instance, Tom Thomson built his own box to contain the sketches. And there are many photos of, say, MacDonald and Franklin Carmichael, for instance. There's a photo also. They all had these boxes, which are really quite small, often built by themselves, and they had slots in them. And the box had a double function. You could close it up and carry it on your back. In fact, it was lightweight. You could slot into those slots, say, 4 panels that you would paint on during the day. And you would sit with the box open on your knee, so that it actually functioned as an easel as well. So you would paint then, as all of you would come out of the day with, say, 4 quickly done sketches, all of them wet, potentially plastered in bugs, I would imagine, frankly, having my experience, my limited experience of Canadian landscape. And they would slot them into the slots so that they didn't hit up against each other, so that the paint surface as it dried was protected. So there you go. Very clever.
Well, what ingenuity. That's remarkable. Let's move on to a question about Emily Carr. You did talk about her a little bit, but she had a very interesting relationship with Harris in particular and their correspondences. Who influenced whom, and do we have any idea of, that's a common question, how their relationship played out in their works?
Well, actually, it's not as common a question as it should be, actually, because for reasons beyond my ken, it's often assumed that the influence must have been one way, and that it was Lauren Harris who influenced Emily Carr. Now, the thing is, he had a very important role in her life. Effectively, she had given up painting. And then in 1927, she gave up for 15 years because nobody was buying her work. And she gave up and then was rediscovered, as it were, in 1927 and featured in a major exhibition of West Coast art in Ottawa at the National Gallery. And at that point, she met the Group of Seven and she went around all of their studios. That's what Lismer was recording in that hilarious little sketch, actually, it was her. But it was Harris that she really bonded with. Emily Carr was a spiritual person in her own right. Lauren Harris was a raging theosophist, as we know. And so he encouraged her to take up painting again. So we owe him that. He really did. And he also had a very important influence in the sense that he advised Emily to really paint what she loved. Up to then, she had painted, she'd gone up and down the west coast of British Columbia, recording the villages of the First Nations there. And she, you know, that was kind of her project. He persuaded her to paint the forests. And that, because he said, basically, if you're painting totem poles, you're painting borrowed spirituality. And she responded to that. And so we owe him a lot. But I also suspect that the influence went the other way. It's difficult to judge. My colleague Sarah Milroy, our wonderful chief curator at McMichael, will be looking at this in more detail in a great show that's coming up, if we can ever open again, in Uninvited. It's called Uninvited, and there'll be a room devoted to Emily Carr, and I think she's really going to look into that. She thinks, and who am I to disagree with Sarah Milroy, that that influence went both ways.
Very interesting, and we're all looking forward to that exhibition and the accompanying book that will go along with that show. And I'll also plug your past publication with Sarah Milroy, Emily Carr, From the Forest to the Sea. So if anyone wants to do more reading about Emily Carr, look up that book. Another question, a bit broader. Did the Group of Seven notably influence paintings of artists working in other countries? You talked a bit about the influences on them, but were they influential on other contemporaries in other countries?
This is actually quite a difficult question. I think in general, I would say no, but one does have to bear in mind, again, the great Lauren Harris is the example, because he was actually, he moved to the States, a bit of a scandal there. He left his wife and ran off with his best friend's wife. And they had to leave Canada because it became too hot for them. But he actually ended up in sort of Santa Fe, that area, and was a friend of Georgia O'Keeffe, for instance. Now, whether, again, it's the same question for Emily Carr, who influenced whom? In fact, if you were to say, who does Lauren Harris, is there anyone that Lauren Harris reminds you of in those wonderful mountain paintings? I think the answer would be Georgia O'Keeffe. So it may have gone either way. I don't know. But out beyond that, the influence of the Group of Seven is not, it's not really quantifiable. But I would just say, in 1986-87, when I worked as a junior curatorial assistant at the Royal Academy of Arts, the reason I'm here to this day, and in Canada at all, and in my current privileged position with the best job in the country, is because I opened a book in the Royal Academy of Arts library where my desk was as curatorial assistant. In the Royal Academy of Arts library was a little cache of books about the Group of Seven. I've never understood why, but I think that the Group of Seven were known amongst artists in Britain. They were a closely guarded secret, but I think they were always admired as painters by other painters. But nobody has done any work in actually ascertaining, A, who got those books for the Royal Academy of Arts library, because that would be interesting to know, or B, whether in fact there was an influence that went from Canada to the UK. There's a PhD subject for someone. I hope someone's listening.
I was going to say, it sounds like a future essay or even book or exhibition in the making. And I think we're all very grateful to the Royal Academy as well for that little cache of books, and also to Uncle Horace for his bringing you to this
Horace.
Final question, and to all of those that we didn't get to, thank you for your questions. We will certainly consider them for future topics on our McMichael from Home videos that we post on social media, so stay tuned if we didn't get to your question. Final question, where in today's Canadian art is the Group of Seven's influence most felt or most evident?
Oh, that is actually a very difficult question to answer. Because as I said in my talk, one of the things I discovered very quickly when I moved to Canada, going to art fairs, you see echoes of the Group of Seven everywhere. There are still painters who Greg Hardy, for instance, is a name that comes to mind in Saskatchewan, who paints like Group of Seven. They've clearly been influenced by the painterliness of it. But we have an interesting example actually hanging at the gallery at the moment, which is not where you'd expect it, which is Brenda Draney, who is a First Nations artist, a wonderful young contemporary artist, who we just installed before we closed, sadly, an exhibition of her work. She's highly thought of, highly collected, across the world now, I might add. But to our surprise, she chose to do some paintings based around Casson's white pine that I showed in my slideshow. And I thought, it's the last thing I would have expected from a young Indigenous artist like that. But Brenda explained that, in fact, she, like so many other Canadians, was raised with an image, a Group of Seven reproduction on the wall of her home. And of course, the white pine, which was the painting concerned, looked amazingly different from the landscape outside her window, and she was always intrigued by it and actually slightly disturbed by it as a result. And so it oddly loomed large. And I think you could trace that kind of influence in some very surprising places to this day.
Well, thank you for that, Ian. I know that we could all listen to you go on all day, but we'll give your voice a rest. And I know there's another voice. I know there's another voice that we're all anxious to hear from, and that is from our dear friend at the McMichael, Bruce Cockburn, who has this very special song for the occasion. I would be remiss as well if I didn't mention that we will have a book coming out in the fall, authored by Ian and a number of other Canadian artists, writers, and thinkers, including an appreciation from Bruce Cockburn as well on the Group of Seven. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, I will pass it over to Bruce to introduce his song to all of us. Thank you, Ian.
Greetings, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you on this occasion, and I have an old song I want to do that's kind of suitable for the content of the paintings in question and the stories we read of those artists. This is called Let Us Go Laughing. My canoe lies on the water, evening holds the bones of day. The sun, like gold dust, slips away. One by one, antique stars herald the arrival of their pale protectress moon. Ragged branches vibrate, strummed by winds from o'er the hills. Singing tales of ancient days. far and silent lightning stirs the cauldron of the sky. I turn my bow toward the shore.
Hello again. That was wonderful. Let's go laughing on. Thank you so much, Bruce Cockburn. That was a perfect song to end with. Thank you all for joining us. As I said, I hope you all raise a glass this evening to the group of 7 for all that they did for Canada, and for the fact that they are just such wonderful artists. I'll close there. Goodbye.